24:14 A Testimony to All Peoples. Chapter 21 Brutal Facts by Justin Long. Just before Jesus ascended to heaven, he gave his disciples the task we refer to as the Great Commission, to go into all the world making disciples for every people group. Ever since then, Christians have dreamed of one day when this task would be completed. Many of us connect it with Matthew 24:14. Jesus promised that the gospel will be preached to the whole world as a witness to all nations, and then the end will come. Although we may debate the precise meaning of the passage, we tend to think of the task will be completed, and completion is somehow tied to the end. While we eagerly anticipate Christ's return, we must face some brutal facts. If the end of the task and the return of Jesus somehow correlate, his return is likely still far off. By many measures, the end of the task is getting further and further away from us. How do we measure the end of the task? Two possibilities are tied to these scriptures: a measure of proclamation and a measure of discipleship. As a measure of discipleship, we can consider both how much of the world claims to be Christian and how much of the world could be considered an active disciple. The Center for the Study of Global Christianity, CSGC, counts Christians of all kinds. They tell us that in 1990, 33% of the world was a Christian. In 2000, 33% of the world was a Christian. And by 2050, unless things change dramatically, the world will still be 33% Christian. A church that only grows at the same rate of the population is not going to bring the gospel to the whole world as a witness to all peoples. What about active disciples? This is a measure far more difficult, since we can't really know the state of the heart. But in the future of the global church, Patrick Johnson estimated evangelicals at about 6.9% of the world's population in 2010. Researchers shows a number of evangelicals is growing more rapidly than most other segments of Christianity, but continues to be a small percentage of the world. The number of believers isn't the only measure of completing the task. However, proclamation, as noted above, is another. Some people will hear the gospel and accept it. Three measures of proclamation are widely used: unevangelized, unreached, and unengaged. Then that's according to an organization called Mission Frontiers and their website, missionfrontiers.org, of an article which was titled "Which Peoples Need Priority Attention" from 2007. Unevangelized is an attempt to measure who has no access to the gospel, who realistically will not have a chance to hear the good news and respond to it in their lifetime. CSGC estimates 54% of the world was unevangelized in 1990, and 28% is unevangelized today. This is good news, right? The percentage of the world with no access to the gospel has dropped significantly. However, the bad news is, in 1990, the total population of unevangelized people was only 880 million. Today, due to population growth, that number has risen to 2.1 billion. While the percentage of unevangelized people was cut nearly in half, the total number of people with no access has more than doubled. The remaining task has grown in size. Another term is unreached. Unreached is slightly different. It measures which unevangelized groups do not have a local indigenous church that can bring the gospel to the whole group without the aid of cross-cultural missionaries. Joshua Project lists around 7,000 unreached people groups, totaling 3.15 billion people, which is 42% of the world. Finally, the term unengaged. Unengaged groups are those lacking any engagement by a church planting team. Today, there are 1,500 such groups. The number has been declining since its introduction in 1999 by the IMB. This decline is a good sign, but it means that for every newly engaged groups, It means that for newly engaged groups, the work is not finished, only newly begun. It is far easier to engage a group with the church planting team than to see lasting results. The brutal fact is that by any of these measures, unengaged, unreached, unevangelized, none of our existing efforts will reach all the people in all the groups anytime soon. We see several key reasons for this. First, most Christian effort goes to places where the church is rather than places where it is not. Most money given to Christians causes is spent on ourselves, and even most mission money is spent in majority Christian areas. For every $100,000 in personal income, the average Christian gives $1 to the unreached. That is 0.0001%. Deployment of personnel also reflects this problematic imbalance. Only 3% of cross-cultural missionaries serve among the unreached. If we count all full-time Christian workers, only 0.37% serve the unreached. We send one missionary to every 179,000 Hindus, one missionary to every 260,000 Buddhists, and one to every 405,500 Muslims. Secondly, most Christians are out of touch with the non-Christian world. Globally, 81% of all non-Christians do not personally know a believer. For Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists, that rises to 86%. In the Middle East and North Africa, the percentage is 90%. In Turkey and Iran, it is 93%, and in Afghanistan, 97% of people do not personally know a Christian. Third, the churches we are sustaining exist largely in places with slow population growth. Global population is growing fastest in places where we are not. Christianity remained static in the world's population from 1910 to 2010. Meanwhile, Islam grew from 12% of the world's population to 15% from 1910 to 1970, and to an estimated 23.9% in 2020. This was largely due to population growth, not conversion. But the fact remains that the last century Islam has also doubled as a percentage of the world, and the percentage of Christians has remained the same. So that paragraph is saying that Christianity exists in place where there's not as much population group growth as where we are not. Fourth, the Christian world is fractured and lacks unity to work together to achieve the Great Commission. Globally, there are an estimated 41,000 denominations. The number of mission agencies has skyrocketed from 600 in 1900 to 5,400 mission agencies today. A general lack of communication between them, much less coordination, is crippling the efforts to make disciples of all ethne. Fifth, many churches have an inadequate emphasis on discipleship, obedience to Christ, and willingness to follow Him wholeheartedly. Low commitment yields little production and runs the risk of declining or imploding. This shows up in the loss of Christians who leave the church. On average, in an average year, 5 million people choose to become Christians, but 13 million people choose to leave Christianity. If the current trends continue from 2010 to 2050, 40 million people will switch to Christianity, while 106 million people will leave. Sixth, we have not adapted strategically to the reality of global church. Global South Christians, Global South means the 1040 window. Global South Christians grew from 20% of the world's Christians in 1910 to an estimated 64.7% by 2020. Yet the Global North Church still has a large portion of Christian wealth. Due to ethnocentrism and narrow perspectives, we prioritize sending people from our own cultures as missionaries. We continue using most of our resources to support distant culture teams engaging unreached people groups rather than prioritizing and adequately resourcing near culture teams to reach the neighboring unreached groups. Seventh, we are losing ground. As a result of previous 6 points and other factors, we are a growing number of both lost people and in general unreached people in particular. There are a growing number of both lost people in general and unreached people in particular. The number of lost people in the world has grown from 3.2 billion people to 5 billion people in 2015, while the without access to the gospel has grown from 1.1 billion people in 1985 to 2.2 billion in 2018. Despite our earnest desire to fulfill the Great Commission, unless we change how we run the race, current trends tell us we have no likelihood of seeing the finish line anytime soon. We can never close the gap on lostness incrementally. We need to face the brutal fact that missions and church planting, as usual, will not reach the goal. We need movements where the number of new believers exceeds the annual growth rate of the population. We need churches multiplying churches and movements multiplying movements among the unreached. This is not a dream or a mere theory. God is doing this in some places. There are over 650 church planting movements, at least 4 separate streams of consistent 4+ generation of churches that are spread throughout every continent. There are 250 emerging movements that are seeing 2nd and 3rd generation church multiplication. We must pay attention to what God is doing, and He will be willing to realistically willingly and realistically evaluate our efforts so we can trade minimally fruitful strategies for highly fruitful ones. And there's a graph of the increase of movements from 1995 to 2017 going steadily up.